qualitative research is extremely important. But even before you do qualitative research, I think there is an orientation shift that companies need, where right now the assumption is that technology designers know best, and that a lot of the insight is housed in-house. And so we will sort of tell you, what good technology is, and we will tell the users how to use it. And if users are not using it properly, then it's their fault, and we have to figure out how to get them to think like us.
Right.
And I think for me, this engagement with drivers was a big shift in that orientation, where I approached this positioning drivers as the experts in that context. I went in being like, you tell me, I want to learn from you why you are doing this, how you are doing this, how this sort of changes your employment and the platform. So I think a lot of times as researchers within companies, we sort of unconsciously sometimes even try to hold all the power. Like, we define the research question, we define the protocol, we define the kind of insights that we want, right? We're looking at like, here is the technology that we have made and here's how it's great. Now just tell us how you're going to use it. But I think like we need to maybe approach it in a more open-ended way, where we go to the users and say, what are your pain points? What are your solutions? What are the things you have been designing for? And once I did that, like, drivers in Jakarta were constantly designing very interesting technological solutions to their problems that the platform was not resolving.
It's hard to analyze this data. It doesn't mean that it's not data. It's actually very rich sort of data. How do you transform that into an AI context, into AI companies? I think John Delina asked this in the chat. How do you take this learning and then convince an AI platform company that this is true?
It's hard. I'm still figuring that out. So sure. I don't have any good answers yet. It's a process. I think one thing is to be very convinced about the kind of strengths of your method. So in this case, for example, I'll give you the example of this text image model qualitative research that we did. When I present this internally within Google, I kind of emphasize what this method got us that we would just not have gotten through a large-scale survey, that we wouldn't have gotten through a rater task, that we couldn't have gotten through like any like observational data, right? Like the kind of like nuance around stereotypes, around visual metrics that people were using, around what were the culturally important things people wanted to generate. Like, these are all things that we just couldn't have gotten. So I think like focusing on the strengths of your method is one way. I think the other thing is there is some translation work and thinking required on your end also of how these insights can be integrated. Right. So in my case, for example, I almost try to pitch this as foundational knowledge that you can then build larger scale classifiers atop of. Right. So it's like you're not going to know how to measure something you don't know exists. Right. So qualitative research is a good way of figuring out what exists, how it exists, and then you can think about building metrics, right? So if, for example, the stereotype of poverty is not something we knew existed, how can we build like responsible AI metrics and classifiers around it? So that's how I've been sort of presenting it, as thinking about like community engaged research, annotator-based research, and then like quantitative or like larger scale automated like benchmark development as part of like a holistic framework. And I'm sort of very clear about what qualitative research, the kind of foundational insights qualitative research brings, which you can then take and build. It gives you signals and directions, right? But for that signal, you need qualitative research.
What is one thing that we should all know about qualitative research that is not widely known and is not mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give this answer as someone who's working in a like an industry that is dominated by, computer scientists, machine learning
Quant research.
researchers, engineers.
Right.
Um, and so I mean, I don't know if this is all mainstream or
Right.
not mainstream, but like definitely not mainstream in the context that I work in. One thing I think is important to recognize about qualitative research is one, like just how rigorous it is, right? It's not just, there's a lot of times when people ask us, so basically just like you went and talked to a couple of people and
It's anecdotal, is what they say.
Yeah. But I think like it is, of course, there's like a method to it, but anecdotes are also data.
Right.
Right? Anecdotes are also, even if it was just anecdotes, anecdotes are also data. And I think sometimes in our quest for this like desire for generalizability, like machine learning and computer scientists like love the question of scale and generalizability, we forget to ask what is it that we're generalizing. And so if we're trying to fundamentally generalize something that is not generalizable, then that doesn't make sense. So I think recognizing that the world is a messy place, it's not a place where things can generalize often. And qualitative research is a great tool to not just uncover the messiness, but try to make some sense of it and try to use that messiness to your advantage and like gain insights from it. So I think for me, I think of qualitative research as going out into this world that's very complex, picking up one part of it and then trying to make sense of that complexity, as opposed to trying to impose this external order, this like superficial order on a world that is complex, which I think just doesn't work at all. So I think for me, like people talk about, if there was one thing that I would say to people who don't do qualitative research, is that yes, it is not generalizable, but it's not generalizable because the world is not generalizable. And I would much rather delve into that world of complexity and try to understand it, as opposed to impose my own understanding on the world. And that's especially true for technology design. As customers of AI technology, basically, one thing to think about is, are you deploying these models into areas that fundamentally they are not structurally suited for? I think there's so much like hype and excitement about like generative AI, for example, right now, for good reason, right? It's a very exciting technology. But I think like as customers of these models, I think you have a right to ask companies like, does this model make sense in this particular like application context that I'm trying to use it for? What are the limitations of your technology, right? Like, I think we focus so much on what technologies can do and what new technologies can do that we forget to ask what they can't do. And that creates this like incongruent mismatch where people integrate technologies into places where they just don't work. And when I say don't work, it doesn't mean you get like an error code and you're like, oh, failure. It means that the thing that technology is producing is just completely wrong.
Right.
Because it's not like well suited for the task. So, for example, I know there's been a lot of research on automated hiring software, right? Like CV screening software. And if you really think about it, some of the limitations of that technology were very quickly discovered when people started, for example, putting in like white text on CVs because they realized that a lot of the softwares were basically just like scanning for like top university names. And so they could put in like, I don't know, University of Oxford in like white text on their CV and like pass through the scan, right? So I think it's important for these companies to ask the technology designers, like, how does this work? Structurally, what is it doing, like from A to B? When I when I deploy it, what is the process that it's going to follow? And then think, does that process make sense for the task specification that I have in mind? So I think that's one thing that like we have to have this conversation of where these technologies are suited to be deployed and where they're not. I was going to say that, like, I think to one of the points in chat about like holding their own when people are dismissive, I do want to say, like, I recognize it's hard, right? Like, it is a battle, and I'm so sorry that people and all of us have to go through this exhausting emotional, like, professional labor to constantly be like, we belong, we are important. I think for me, like, what's really helped is being part of a team that really respects my work. So at least day to day, like, I don't have to, fight for that respect. But I think something that's helped when we're talking to like other people within Google is examples really help. So if you can marshal a good corpus of examples, whether from your research or someone else's research, where qualitative data brought out insights that were important and pivotal and otherwise would have been missed. I think that human beings respond to stories, and that's kind of ingrained in our DNA, evolutionary imperative. And so we respond to stories, we respond to examples. So if you have those stories, I would just like create a deck that just marshals that when needed.
Any parting words of wisdom? If there was one point that you wanted the audience today to take home in just 30 seconds, what would that be?
I would say, like, as qualitative researchers, own your expertise. And as non-qualitative researchers, I hope this kind of gave you an understanding of how incredibly powerful and essential qualitative, it's not just powerful, it's essential, I would say. Qualitative research is essential to building any technology that wants to engage with users.